Humans are only good for dying dramatically, scoffed Commander Grelnak, his mandibles clicking with derision as he watched the Terran Marine walk into the briefing room. Captain Reynolds didn't flinch. He didn't snarl back, didn't let the insult slide. He just smiled, a calm, lopsided grin that never reached his eyes. The kind of smile that said, "You'll figure it out soon enough." Grelnak, like most of the Yorvash, had little patience for creatures who relied so heavily on soft skin and brittle bones to move through life. His kind had exoskeletons dense enough to withstand railgun fire, eyes that saw across spectrums most creatures didn't even know existed, and a metabolism that could keep them active for days without rest. He towered over Reynolds, a living tank that made the human seem like a delicate figurine. The idea that these fragile creatures had earned a seat in the coalition was laughable. Until now, Grelnak had only ever tolerated humans because it was diplomatically required. The Marine didn't argue, didn't explain, didn't even defend himself. He merely walked to his seat, took it without a sound, and waited for the debriefing to begin. "Right," Grelnak growled, turning his attention back to the holographic display at the center of the table. "Our mission is a simple one. Recover the mining station personnel stranded in Sector 7. We've received reports of severe thermal anomalies in the area, likely due to reactor instability. This makes a ground team necessary. Unfortunately for us, the surface temperature will be..." Grelnak hesitated as he reviewed the data again. "Unpleasant." Reynolds raised an eyebrow but said nothing. The Jorvash commander scowled, clearly irritated by the lack of a reaction. "How unpleasant?" asked Lieutenant Garin, a Zekran whose physiology resembled a large, upright reptile. His forked tongue flicked nervously as he scanned the heat levels. "That kind of heat will melt our surface suits in minutes." "Exactly," Grelnak snapped, "which is why the crew will remain aboard the Icarian Spear. Only automated drones will attempt to reach the survivors. Minimal risk." The human leaned forward, his face calm but alert. "If the drones fail, do we have a plan B?" Grelnak's mandibles clacked in irritation. "The drones will not fail." "And if they do," Reynolds pressed. Grelnak glared at the human. "Then we write off the station." The silence that followed was thick. Garin shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Reynolds before speaking. "Commander, if I may, there are 37 personnel stranded down there. Surely we owe them a better contingency than abandonment?" Grelnak's glare deepened. "The Coalition does not throw away resources recklessly. If retrieval becomes impossible, we cut our losses." "Resources," Reynolds muttered under his breath, barely audible. Garin's head tilted in curiosity, but he didn't press the Marine for clarification. Grelnak bristled. "Do you have a problem with protocol, human?" Reynolds shrugged. "Just wondering if it's the protocol or your exoskeleton that's tougher." Before the commander could respond, an alert blared through the room. The hologram shifted, displaying an emergency signal from the mining station. Grelnak tapped the console, and a grainy video feed blinked to life. A Yareth engineer appeared on the screen, his greenish skin glistening with sweat. Behind him, the station's interior glowed orange, warped from the extreme heat. "This is Engineer Volk of Mining Station Zeta 4. Our cooling systems have failed completely. Reactor meltdown imminent. We need immediate evac." The feed cut off abruptly, leaving only static. Grelnak slammed a clawed hand on the console, cutting off the sound. "The drones will be launched immediately. Dismissed." Reynolds didn't move. His eyes stayed fixed on the frozen image of Volk, his mouth set in a hard line. "Commander, request permission to join the retrieval team." Grelnak's laugh was sharp and humorless. "Request denied. You'd be incinerated within minutes." "Maybe," Reynolds replied, "but drones don't improvise. People do." Grelnak leaned in, towering over the human. "This isn't a holodrama where courage defies physics. Your soft flesh would cook in that environment, Marine. Stand down." The captain met Grelnak's gaze without flinching. "Permission to speak freely?" "Denied," Grelnak growled, but Reynolds spoke anyway. 37 people down there are about to die. If the drones can't get them out, someone's got to try. I'm not saying I'll succeed, but I'd rather fail trying than sit up here and pretend there wasn't a chance." Garin hissed quietly, a sound that could have been approval or nervousness. Grelnak's mandibles clicked rapidly, a sure sign of his frustration. This discussion is over. Reynolds didn't argue further. Instead, he stood, nodded once, and left the room. Garin waited until the door slid shut before turning to Grelnak. "Commander, do you think he'll follow orders?" Grelnak's laughter was bitter. "Humans never do." The next hours passed in tense anticipation. The drones were deployed, navigating the station's volatile surface in a desperate attempt to locate survivors. Grelnak monitored the operation with an intensity that suggested he didn't entirely trust his own equipment. Then the first drone failed. A wave of molten debris from a reactor explosion engulfed it, cutting the video feed instantly. A second drone followed, its sensors overloaded by the extreme heat. By the time the third drone was lost, it became clear that automated retrieval was hopeless. Grelnak's mandibles twitched furiously. "All drones lost. Mission aborted." The words were barely out of his mouth when alarms blared again. This time, the display showed a new heat signature moving across the station's surface. It wasn't a drone, it was Reynolds. The Marine had donned an experimental heat suit from the ship's research bay, its prototype design barely field-tested. While it offered more protection than standard gear, it was never intended for the kind of temperatures currently ravaging the mining station. Grelnak roared. "What is that fool doing?" "Trying," Garin murmured, almost to himself. Reynolds moved with purpose, his every step deliberate. The suit's outer layer was already beginning to degrade. The once pristine plating scorched black in some areas. He carried a reinforced case of emergency coolant, its weight slowing him down but not stopping him. The room watched in stunned silence as the human reached the station's airlock. Static filled the comms as Reynolds attempted to override the damaged controls. Finally, the door slid open and the Marine disappeared inside. Grelnak slammed a claw into the console. "Get me that idiot on comms, now!" A technician scrambled to comply, patching through the connection. Reynolds' voice crackled over the speakers, strained but steady. "This is Reynolds. I'm inside. Starting evacuation procedures." "Marine, return to the ship immediately," Grelnak barked. "No can do, Commander," Reynolds replied. "People here need help. I'll keep you posted." The feed cut again, leaving Grelnak seething. "He's going to get himself killed." "Maybe," Garin said quietly, "but he's also giving those 37 a chance." Reynolds moved deeper into the station, the narrow corridors radiating a suffocating heat that pressed against the experimental suit's limits. The emergency coolant pack on his back hissed softly, releasing vapor in bursts to keep the temperature inside the suit marginally survivable. Even so, his vision blurred, sweat dripping into his eyes as the inner layer of his suit struggled to maintain a breathable environment. "Status report, Reynolds," came Grelnak's voice, crackling over the comms. The commander's tone was sharp, more annoyance than concern. "Found them," Reynolds answered. His voice was clipped but steady. Ahead of him, a group of survivors huddled in what had once been a mess hall, their faces illuminated by the angry red glow of nearby reactor fires. Many were slumped against walls or sprawled on the floor, their bodies showing the early signs of severe heat exhaustion. Reynolds toggled his comm to a private channel. "This is bad, Garin. Some of them won't be able to move on their own." "Do what you can," Garin replied, his voice low but calm. "We're monitoring you. The temperature is spiking. Whatever you're going to do, make it fast." "Noted," Reynolds muttered. He took a step forward, addressing the group. "All right, listen up. I'm here to get you out. The longer we stay, the worse this gets, so let's move." A Zervani technician raised his head weakly. "The drones. They failed. What makes you think you'll succeed?" "Because I'm not a drone," Reynolds said simply. He crouched next to the nearest crew member, a hulking Ravelite miner whose thick carapace was cracked in several places. "Can you walk?" The miner groaned. "Barely." "Good enough." Reynolds hauled him upright, the strain obvious even through the heat suit's reinforced joints. The miner's weight threatened to topple them both, but Reynolds braced himself and began moving toward the exit. "Everyone else, pair up. Help each other. If you can walk, carry someone who can't. We're all getting out." The survivors hesitated, their expressions a mix of disbelief and fear. None of them had expected to see a human, let alone one risking his life in an environment no one else could survive. But something in Reynolds' tone cut through their doubts. Slowly they began to move, leaning on one another as they followed the Marine. Back on the Icarian spear, The bridge was silent except for the hum of equipment and the occasional hiss of static from Reynolds' comm. Grelnak paced furiously, his claws clicking against the metal floor. "This is madness," the commander growled. "He'll never make it back." Garen, who had been watching the heat readings, glanced at Grelnak. "He's already done more than the drones." Grelnak's mandibles twitched, but he said nothing. Meanwhile, Reynolds led the survivors through the station's sweltering corridors, their progress agonizingly slow. The coolant pack on his back began to sputter, its reserves nearly depleted. A warning light on his HUD flashed insistently, but he ignored it. "Captain," Garen's voice came through the comm. "You've got less than 10 minutes before the suit fails. You need to pick up the pace." "Working on it," Reynolds replied. He turned to the group. "Keep moving. The airlock's just ahead." As if in response, the station shuddered violently, a deep rumble echoing through its walls. One of the reactor cores had collapsed, sending a wave of heat and debris rippling through the structure. Reynolds threw himself over a fallen survivor, shielding them as a section of ceiling caved in behind them. "We're out of time, sure," he said, his voice tight. "Double time, people. Let's go." The group surged forward, desperation lending them strength. Reynolds stayed at the rear, urging stragglers along and lifting those who stumbled. The airlock was in sight now, a faint glimmer of hope amidst the oppressive heat. But hope wasn't enough to stop the second explosion. The blast was smaller than the first but closer, the force knocking several survivors off their feet. Reynolds slammed into the wall, the impact driving the air from his lungs. His suit's alarms wailed, the display flickering as the system struggled to compensate. "Reynolds!" Garen's voice was urgent. "You're at critical heat levels. You need to get out now." "Not without them," Reynolds rasped. He pushed himself upright, ignoring the sharp pain in his ribs. Ahead of him, the survivors were struggling to rise, their exhaustion compounded by the relentless heat. "You!" Reynolds pointed to the Shirvani technician, who was still standing. "Help the others. Get them through the airlock." "What about you?" the technician asked, his voice trembling. "I'll cover the rear," Reynolds said firmly. "Move!" The Shirvani hesitated but obeyed, helping the others toward the airlock. Reynolds followed, his movements growing slower with each step. His suit's outer layer was almost entirely blackened now, and the coolant pack had long since failed. By the time the last survivor stumbled through the airlock, Reynolds was barely standing. His vision swam, the edges darkening as the heat clawed at his consciousness. He staggered forward, one hand gripping the airlock's frame as he hit the manual override. "Bridge," he managed to say, his voice barely audible over the comm. "Survivors are out. Start pulling them in." "What about you?" Garen asked. Reynolds leaned against the airlock, his breath coming in shallow gasps. "I'll follow." "Liar," Grelnak muttered from the bridge, his mandibles clicking furiously. "Garen, prepare a rescue team." "There's no time," Garen said quietly. "If we send a team, we risk losing everyone." Grelnak didn't respond, his claws flexing in frustration. Inside the airlock, Reynolds forced himself upright. His body screamed in protest, every movement an effort. He turned toward the station's inferno-filled corridors, scanning for any signs of life he might have missed. "Captain," Garen's voice broke through the haze. "You've done enough. Get out of there." Reynolds didn't answer. Instead, he took a single, unsteady step back into the fire. The corridor was collapsing around him. Heat rippled through the station, warping metal and filling the air with the acrid tang of burning polymers. Reynolds stumbled forward, his legs heavy as if encased in lead. The suit alarms had gone silent, their systems fried by the inferno. He had only his instincts to guide him now. Reaching the last junction, he found nothing but wreckage. The rooms ahead had caved in entirely, their contents consumed by molten debris. Reynolds scanned the area, squinting through the haze. No movement, no sounds, nothing. Every instinct screamed at him to turn back, to retreat while he still could. But Reynolds didn't move. He leaned against the wall, catching his breath as his mind replayed every face he'd seen on the station's roster. 37. He'd counted 36 survivors in the mess hall. Someone was missing. "Reynolds," Garen's voice came through the comm, faint but insistent. "Where are you? The airlock's sealed and we're pulling the survivors into the bay." "Still here," Reynolds rasped. His throat felt like sandpaper, his voice barely more than a whisper. "One unaccounted for. I'll find them." There's no time, Garen protested. The station's reactor is seconds away from total meltdown. Then I'd better hurry, Reynolds said. He pushed off the wall, forcing himself forward. His vision narrowed, the edges swimming in a kaleidoscope of heat and exhaustion. He found the missing crew member in a collapsed maintenance shaft. The alien was a Varric, its massive frame pinned beneath a section of twisted support beams. Its breathing was labored, its multi-limb body scorched from the heat. "Hang tight," Reynolds said, his voice cracking. He crouched next to the trapped alien, assessing the damage. The beams were too heavy to lift, even for the suit's enhanced servos. He'd have to improvise. The Varric's segmented eyes opened, focusing on Reynolds with a mixture of pain and disbelief. "Why are you here? You should have left." "Not my style," Reynolds replied. He retrieved the emergency plasma cutter from his toolkit, activating it with a flick of his wrist. The device hummed to life, its blue flame barely visible in the orange glow of the corridor. The Varric coughed, a deep, rattling sound. "You'll die for this." "Yeah, probably," Reynolds said. He began cutting through the beams, sparks flying as the plasma blades sliced through the metal. "But if I leave you, I've got to live with that." The first beam fell away with a screech, freeing one of the Varric's limbs. Reynolds moved to the second, his movement slower now as the heat drained what little energy he had left. On the Icarian spear, Grelnak watched the station's heat signature spike on the monitors. The reactor was seconds from going critical. He slammed a clawed fist onto the console, his frustration boiling over. That reckless human is going to doom himself. And for what? One life? Garen didn't answer. His eyes remained fixed on the screen, watching the faint signal of Reynolds' suit. The final beam gave way, and the Varric let out a low groan as it pulled itself free. Its legs buckled, unable to support its weight. Reynolds caught the alien's arm, hauling it upright with a grunt. "Can you walk?" he asked. The Varric nodded weakly. "Barely." "Good enough," Reynolds said, echoing his earlier words. He slung the alien's arm over his shoulder, half carrying, half dragging it toward the airlock. The corridor shuddered violently as another explosion rocked the station, sending debris raining down around them. "Reynolds!" Garen's voice was urgent now. "We're out of time. If you're not at the airlock in 30 seconds, you're not getting out." "Understood," Reynolds replied. He didn't quicken his pace. He couldn't, but his grip on the Varric tightened. "Just keep the door open." The airlock came into view, its outer door still sealed. Reynolds activated the manual override, the mechanism groaning in protest as the system fought against the failing power grid. The door slid open just enough for them to squeeze through. The Varric stumbled inside first, collapsing onto the airlock floor. Reynolds followed, slamming the control panel to initiate the decompression sequence. The inner door opened and a burst of cool air hit them, a stark contrast to the furnace they just escaped. Reynolds collapsed onto the deck, his suit hissing as it vented the last of its coolant reserves. His head swam, darkness creeping in at the edges of his vision. He barely registered the sound of the Icarian Spear's crew rushing into the airlock to drag him and the Varric to safety. When he came to, Reynolds was lying on a stretcher in the medbay. His suit had been stripped away, leaving only the burns and bruises that covered his body. Garen stood at his side, his reptilian features unreadable. "You're awake," Garen said. "Disappointed?" Reynolds croaked, a faint smile tugging at his lips. "Impressed," Garen replied. "And I'm not the only one." Reynolds turned his head, wincing at the effort. The survivors filled the medbay, their injuries tended to, but their eyes fixed on him. Even Grelnak was there, standing stiffly in the corner. The Jorvash commander's mandibles clicked once, a sound that might have been approval or something close to it. "You broke every protocol in the book," Grelnak said finally. "You disobeyed direct orders, endangered yourself and the mission, and somehow you succeeded." "Guess humans are good for more than dying dramatically," Reynolds said, his voice hoarse but steady. Grelnak's mandibles twitched. "Perhaps." The Varric stepped forward, still leaning heavily on a crutch. It bowed its massive head to Reynolds, a gesture of gratitude that needed no words. As Reynolds closed his eyes, exhaustion finally overtaking him, Garen spoke quietly to Grelnak. "He risked his life for 37 strangers. Not because he had to, because he chose to. Grelnak didn't respond immediately. When he finally spoke, his tone was grudging but sincere. Maybe there's more to these fragile creatures than we thought.